much, good sir. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out. My name is Dana Murchison. I'm going to be your moderator for tonight's Science Cafe event. Tonight's topic is our health and our environment. How does responsibility matter? It's great to see such a packed house of people out tonight. This is actually our last Science Cafe event for our Spring 2014 series, which is fun because I'm sure you've all been enjoying this wonderful spring weather that we've been having lately. It's kind of an interesting Science Cafe for us because we're very grateful for the support of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for this event. And also, we've had the opportunity to present this event in partnership with a number of groups from Laurentian and from the University of Sudbury, and it's been co-organized with Jillian Hosier, who's one of our panelists tonight. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Jillian in a couple of minutes to introduce the topic and some of our panelists. But I just wanted to kind of go through a few items about how we run Science Cafes. So first of all, who here has been out to a Science Cafe before? Oh, very fun. Okay, some but not everybody. That's great. So the number one rule of Science Cafes is it's informal. So rule number one, if you want to get up, move around, flag your server during the presentations, please feel free to do so. The format for tonight's event, we're going to start off with brief remarks from each of our four panelists. During that time, if there's anything that really strikes you that you would like to be able to discuss later, there's pens and paper on the tables. Please feel free to jot down some notes to jog your memory a little bit later. We're going to break for about 10 minutes for snacks and just for the opportunity to discuss amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back and we will do 45 minutes or so of moderated discussion. So you'll have an opportunity to ask some of your questions at that point. Also, you will notice that we are video and audio recording tonight's event, so if there's something that you miss and you'd like to catch it later, it will be podcasted and it will be available on our website. And finally, if you are interested in discussing on Twitter, we're using the hashtag SNSciCafe tonight. So if you have a question that you want to raise that you don't necessarily want to stand up and ask, I will be monitoring tweets on my phone. So if you see me on it, I am not making plans for later. I am checking our Twitter feed. I promise I'm fully engaged in this discussion. It's going to be a good one. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jillian for a couple of opening remarks and to introduce our panelists.
So how's the mic? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Is that okay? Closer. All right. Okay. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. So my name is Jillian Crozier. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Laurentian University, and I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Environment, Culture, and Values. In addition, I'm a founding member of the Center for Evolutionary Ecology and Ethical Conservation, who was responsible for putting on the Thinking Extinction event last term. For some of you who may have had an opportunity to attend some of those events. Now, this topic is one that's springing out of a research program that came through CEEEC, which is what we call it, the CEEEC. It's focused on sort of the ethical dimensions of the interactions between health and the environment. So air, water, soil quality, food security, infectious disease transmission. These are just some of the many ways in which our environment has a very profound effect on the world. Has a, how is that?
Oh, yeah.
So there are lots of ways in which our environment has a very profound effect on our health and the health of our community. But how should we allocate responsibilities for these effects? And what role should be played by various parties, so governments, scientists, community groups, healthcare workers, individual citizens, and so on. And importantly, and this is what I'm particularly interested in, how does the way we understand and communicate about these responsibilities make a difference? Because I am a philosopher after all. Now, although I'm on the panel, I'm not an expert in this area by any stretch of the imagination. My role is really to bring together a group of people who can draw out various aspects of this very complicated topic and spur some interesting debate and discussion. So we have here Colleen, Meredith Schwartz. She is an old colleague of mine from Dalhousie. She is an assistant professor of philosophy and a specialist in feminist bioethics from Ryerson University. Next to her is Monique Baudouin. She is a health promotion coordinator at the Centre de Santé Communautaire. Next to her is Colleen Durkach, an assistant professor of English and a specialist in science and medicine rhetoric at Ryerson University also. Now, my own research on the ethics of the connection between environment and health really focuses on, and this is a brand new program, on wildlife disease management and zoonotic diseases. This is a project that I'm looking to start to develop and only have just now taken a foray into. So there are a lot of ways in which the impact that we have on our environment actually affects how these diseases are spread and transmitted, in some cases between animals, in some cases from animals to agriculture populations, and in the case of zoonotic diseases, they can kind of be caught by us. So if you think of avian flu, swine flu, the bubonic plague, or Lyme disease. So if you think about it, as the climate is increasingly warming up, the territories in which some of these diseases can actually, in which they can live and be transmitted is actually spreading. So Lyme disease is one that's actually affected my own family quite personally. My uncle is involved in the mining industry, as many of our families are in Sudbury, and he did spent many years doing survey work, going out to northern areas and collecting geological samples for processing and analysis. And he caught Lyme disease, and it wasn't diagnosed very quickly or very well, and he has been suffering for quite a long time from this very debilitating disease. And in fact, he has to go to the United States in order to get sort of treatment that he needs in order to manage the symptoms. With climate change, many diseases are going to be pushing further and further north where we haven't seen them before. Additionally, things like habitat fragmentation, while pushing wild animals into smaller and smaller enclosures where they are interacting with each other, and that increases the spread of these diseases and their virulence, or it can in some cases. My interest in this is specifically very science-centric. I'm very much in favor of adaptive management programs where science sort of actively is involved in managing and monitoring how these wildlife diseases are handled. So that's kind of my pet project that is in the process of being developed. But although I'll share my perspectives where relevant, mostly I'm here to learn from the panel, from the audience about your interests, and from the discussion. And before I move on, I would just like to point out that this is being co-organized in part by a number of different specific groups. CEEEC, which I mentioned before, the Center for Humanities Research and Creativity at Laurentian, the Humanities MA Program Speaker Series, the University of Sudbury's Ethics Center in particular, I wanted to mention. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
And I'm French-Canadian, so I shouldn't have a hard time getting heard because we speak loudly. Bonsoir, Anine, hello. My name is Monique Baudouin. Je suis coordonnatrice en promotion de la santé au Centre de santé communautaire du Grand Sudbury. I'm the coordinator of health promotion at the Centre de santé communautaire du Grand Sudbury. And I'm actually very nervous right now seeing this full room. And somebody taught me a trick when I was younger. When you speak in front of a big crowd and you're nervous, just imagine that they're all naked. So if I start laughing, you'll know why. So I would like to start by thanking Jillian, Dana, and Jamie for inviting me to participate on this panel. And I thank all of you for being here. Merci beaucoup d'être ici. The topic of this Café Scientifique is our environment and our health, how responsibility matters. What I've learned about this topic, I've learned on the ground. I'm not an academic. I've learned it doing the work that I do and have done over the span of my adult life. Everything from being a human rights observer, observing indigenous communities in Mexico blockade highways to oppose the construction of hydroelectric dams on their land, to supporting and being a co-founder of Rethink Green, our environmental organization here in Sudbury, to the work that I do now at the Centre de Santé. I very much look forward to this exchange with these colleagues and also look forward to furthering my knowledge and thinking around these issues. As a practitioner, I'm not well versed in theory, I can't even say the word, so I won't foray into that fascinating world. I will leave that to my colleagues. The only thing I will talk about that approaches any kind of theoretical framework is the model of care and the determinants of health approach that community health centers take in addressing health issues. Our model of care is very unique in the health sector. Not only do we define ourselves as community-led and community-governed providers of primary health care, but we also have a commitment to the overall health and well-being of the communities we serve, communities that are most often marginalized or disadvantaged in one way or another. In our case, it's the Francophone community. We also recognize the role that social, economic, and environmental factors play in contributing to or in damaging health, and we invest significant human and financial resources in addressing those. Many of these factors are not easily controlled by individual choices and behaviors, but rather by regulatory mechanisms, and they have as much of an impact on health, if not more, than individual lifestyle choices. The Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion has played a key role in shaping the way that CHCs, community health centers, understand and address health issues. Developed at an International Health Promotion Conference in 1986, the Charter outlines the prerequisites for health as well as strategies required to address them. Health promotion is defined as the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. The fundamental conditions and resources for health, according to the Charter, are peace, shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity. Improvement in health requires a secure foundation in these basic prerequisites, and advocacy is an important aspect of health promotion. Political, economic, environmental, and other factors can all favor health or be harmful to it. Health promotion action aims at making these conditions favorable through advocacy for health. It also focuses on achieving equity in health, and our action aims at reducing differences in current health status and ensuring equal opportunities and resources to enable all people to achieve their fullest health potential. So as you can see, our model of care and our grounding in the Ottawa Charter provides us with all the argumentation that we need for addressing environmental and human health, as well as the issue of responsibility and how responsibility matters. In a nutshell, in fact, you could say that CHCs, both individually, as individual CHCs, and as a movement, because there are over 100 of us in Ontario, we strive to ensure that all levels of decision-making, from the systemic to the collective to the individual, assume their share of responsibility for environmental and human health, because it matters. I will now talk briefly about why it matters, particularly in the context of Greater Sudbury, and there are a lot of scientists in this room, so I'm sure a lot of you have this background, but for the younger people. We all know the legacy of the lumbering and mining industries on the environment here in Sudbury. So just to contextualize, I'll do a quick recap from Dr. John Gunn's study called Restoring the Smelter Damaged Landscape near Sudbury, Canada. So I quote from him, "During the past century, Sudbury became one of the largest point sources of acid-forming emissions in the world, with a peak annual production of about 2.5 million tons of sulfur dioxide in 1960. More than 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide and tens of thousands of tons of metal particulates were released into the atmosphere from the smelters during the last century. Approximately 7,000 lakes within a deposition zone of 17,000 square kilometers were acidified. Acidic fumes from the early roast beds and smelters killed the vegetation and led to severe erosion of soils. In the last 40 years, much has been done by a very dedicated team of scientists, community leaders, and community members to redress this situation. Government control programs and new methods of removing high sulfur components from the ore and of capturing sulfur from smelter fumes have greatly reduced atmospheric emissions of pollutants. Since 1960, emissions of sulfur dioxide and metal particulates have declined by about 90%. Significant improvements in water quality have also occurred in lakes and ponds. and Sudbury's world-famous reclamation programs have accelerated the natural recovery processes. And as a result, Sudbury's landscape is now clothed with a soil and vegetation cover that is envied by many mining communities. However, there is still work that needs to be done. The following is an excerpt from the Sudbury Soil Study website. In 2001, the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, the MOE, released a report that identified that the concentrations of nickel, cobalt, copper, and arsenic exceeded the generic MOE soil quality guidelines. Under Ontario legislation, this triggers the need for more detailed study. Therefore, the MOE made two recommendations. One, that a more detailed soil study be undertaken to fill data gaps, and two, that a human health and ecological risk assessment be undertaken. Both Inco and Falconbridge, the mining companies that existed at the time, voluntarily accepted the recommendations and began working together to establish what is commonly referred to as the Sudbury Soil Study. The mining companies partnered with 4 other major stakeholders in Sudbury to oversee this study. The partners formed a technical committee to oversee it, and a public advisory committee was established to help address questions and concerns about the potential impact of elevated metal levels on the local environment and on human health. A comprehensive soil sampling and analysis program was undertaken by the soil study, and over 14,000 samples were collected from urban and remote areas and analyzed for 20 elements. This data forms the basis of the study. I won't go into a lot of detail about the Sudbury Soil Study. I'm not a scientist, and that's not really the purpose of this session tonight. However, suffice it to say that the Sudbury Soil Study was finalized 6 years later with the production of a very complex human health risk assessment and ecological risk assessment. Public comment periods and consultation sessions were held to give the public the opportunity to provide feedback. Unfortunately, very little support was given to the public to even understand the science and the implications of the report. The executive summary of the 2008 Human Health Risk Assessment says some of the following conclusions. So, based on current conditions in the Sudbury area, the study predicted little risk of health effects on Sudbury area residents associated with metals in the environment. 2, there were no unacceptable health risks predicted for exposure to 4 of the 6 chemicals of concern studied, which included arsenic, copper, cobalt, and selenium. I won't say them all, these are just a few examples. That the study calculated a minimal risk of respiratory inflammation from lifetime exposure, 70 years, to airborne nickel in 2 areas of the city, being Coppercliff and the western portion of Sudbury Centre. And finally, that anglers, hunters, and First Nations people who may consume more local fish and wild game are at no greater risk of health effects due to metals in the environment than the general population. Because of the history of the environmental degradation that Sudbury has been subjected to and that I alluded to earlier, and because the 2 mining companies were so involved in the Sudbury Soil Study, it was no surprise that a number of environmentalists, labor representatives, and community members were reluctant to accept these results. For that reason, in 2008, we started a group that became known as the Community Committee on the Sudbury Soil Study. The purpose of the committee was to ensure that the Sudbury community was able to provide informed consent for the risks to the environment and human health from historic and current mining and smelter activities, and to pressure the provincial government to respond effectively to the Sudbury Soil Study and ensure that contamination from mines and smelters in the Sudbury region be properly identified, remediated, and/or contained. To make a long story short, our experience as members of the Community Committee on the Sudbury Soil Study demonstrated very clearly that while we were more than willing to take our responsibility as citizens and as organizational representatives, there were many obstacles that impeded us from doing so in a way that was effective. For example, on 2 occasions, we had to fundraise to pay for our own technical assistance to assist us in reviewing the Human Health Risk Assessment and the Ecological Risk Assessment. Not surprisingly, our technical assistants came up with a different and somewhat more alarming interpretation of the soil study results. Furthermore, we learned from that experience that there's an assumption that minority language communities all speak and read English. This despite the fact that over 35% of Sudbury's population is francophone. Our committee had to pressure the Sudbury Soil Study to provide documentation in French, and then again, we had to pressure them to extend the public comment period to allow francophones the same amount of time to plow through the mounds of paper to be able to come up with an intelligent response. And finally, and I think this was the most important learning from that experience for us, we learned that as non-scientists, it was not until we came together as a group that our voice was heard. Individually, we were having very little impact. We also realized that we had to be very thoroughly prepared, or we would be at best ignored and at worst bullied by some, though not all, of the members of the Public Advisory Committee when we raised our concerns. This happened to us on more than one occasion. As I read this now, I say it with a bit of trepidation, but I fear some of the comments I might get later, and I hope that my scientific colleagues on this panel will have my back. Yes, it is the responsibility of citizens to participate actively in issues that have an impact on the environmental health of our community. But is it our responsibility to become scientists in order to do so? Is it our responsibility to fundraise for the technical assistance we require in order to, and I lost my page number 7, in order to have our questions and concerns addressed? Does responsibility matter in a case like this one? You bet it does. The Sudbury soil study is just one example of environmental work that the Centre Santé has played a role in this community. We became active in that issue because of our grounding in the Ottawa Charter and in the health determinants, but also because, at a gut level, we all know that the historic contamination of our landscape is our individual and collective responsibility. We've benefited from mining in this community, and we've reaped the economic rewards of it, so we do have a responsibility. And finally, we got involved because our community and its desire to take on its responsibility as citizens was ignored until we raised a fuss about it. We've also gotten involved, the Centre Santé, we've also gotten involved in other environmental initiatives like community gardens, the creation of Rethink Green and the Greater Sudbury Earth Day Festival, the promotion of the Good Food Box, and other initiatives. Finally, I want to close with a caution and a number of questions. We have a growing number of people who are slipping out of middle class and struggling more and more to be able to provide and support their families. A growing number of Canadians and Sudburyans are finding themselves losing ground and losing economic opportunities. And the growing gap between rich and poor is evident even here in our neighborhoods. What are the health implications for lower income Sudburyans with regards to climate change and environmental responsibility? We've seen the effects of flooding the past few days in our community. What are the implications for lower income Sudburyans if we start seeing more and more of that? Who will be able to afford living in housing that is further removed from the flood zones? How many of us will be able to afford feeding our families organic foods to offset the impact of agribusiness and climate change? How many of us will be able to afford solar panels when the cost of energy continues to rise and the cost of our current sources of energy continues to take their toll on our ecosystem? And what of our responsibility to the First Nations people whose land we settled on and with whom we've established treaties that regulate our cohabitation of this land? What about that? What are the implications for us as individuals, as a collective, and as society that some of us won't be able to adapt to climate change while others will? And what is our responsibility to those who won't? What's theirs? Do these questions matter? You bet they do. They're questions of ethics and of morals and of responsibility. And it's our responsibility to start addressing them. Thank you. Miigwech, merci.
Thank you so much, Monique. It's definitely clear that we're situating a conversation about health and environment and responsibility in the right community. So next we're going to hear from Colleen Durkach. Thank you. Hello, can you hear me okay? Hi. Okay, so I'm a rhetorical and language theorist, and so I'm in the English department, but I do science and technology studies. And what I mean when I say I'm a rhetoric and language theorist is simply that rhetoric is the study of all of the ways that language moves us towards certain actions and beliefs and behaviors and away from others. So how do we act on each other by influence? How does language move us? And how does this occur through methods that are both conscious and unconscious? And so I'm really interested in the screening power of words and how the words we use affect the decisions that we make, both as individuals and as a collective. And so I picked a few words tonight that I'm going to pick on for a few minutes, and I'm going to say some cranky things about. That's what English professors do. We get a little bit cranky about things. So the words I want to look at are choice, responsibility, knowledge, and risk, because these terms come up again and again in discourses or public talk about the environment and about responsibility. And I want to open these up a little bit. And so I want to just talk a bit about my own research in relation to this topic today. I'm working on 2 projects that both connect nicely to the theme. And basically, the main questions I'm asking are, how does public discourse shape our understanding of health and well-being? And when I say public discourse, I mean all of the ways in which we communicate in public, whether it's newspapers and magazines, whether it's health blogs or health checklists that you bring into your doctor, conversations you have with the doctor, policy, basically all of the ways that we talk in public life. And I want to know, how do we as individuals and collectives weigh evidence and make decisions about courses of action? And so my 2 areas of research right now are, one is about natural health and pharmaceuticals. So how do individuals make choices about whether to take St. John's wort if they're depressed, or whether to take Prozac, whether to try a natural supplement, whether to try pharmaceutical, or both, or neither? What are the factors that go into those decisions? And then the other area, the other project I'm looking at right now, is a study I'm co-researching with Professor Philippa Spool, who is at Laurentian University, sitting in the middle of the room there. And we're doing a project about different forms of health citizenship in language about local foods. We've all heard lots about local foods and to buy local. And what we're trying to understand is, what are we really talking about when we talk about local foods? And what we've identified, and Philippa's taken the lead in this part of the research, but what we've identified is there seem to be 3 key forms of health citizenship. Is this better, or is this better? Is this better? Hello. Okay. So when we're talking about local foods, we tend to be talking about 3 different kinds of health citizenship. One is to be a good health citizen for the health of your own body. One is to be a good health citizen for the health of your economic neighborhood, so supporting local businesses, and then being a good environmental citizen as well. So for example, reduce the production of greenhouse gases in the foods that we consume. And in both of these projects about foods and natural health, I'm looking at the language of choice as the idea of choice is erected in frameworks of responsibility. So how do we make choices? And here's the thing, this is one thing that an English professor can bring to a study of environmental health, is humanities scholars in general are really good at asking what we call prior questions, questions that are conceptually prior to questions that other researchers might ask. So an environmental scientist might ask about the impacts of mining on soil, for example, or a nutritionist could talk about the nutritional benefits of local foods versus foods that are brought in further away. But a humanities scholar can ask questions that come before those questions, to say, well, why are we suddenly now so interested in local foods? Where's that interest coming from? And if we take that interest and try to open it up, we can learn a little bit more about the kinds of food systems we want to have. Because I think that the resurgence of interest in local foods is partly a rejection of conventional farming practices. But things get kind of murky when you look a little bit closer at local foods. So in this project about local and organic foods, I'm just going to talk about that for a minute here. So we've got these different forms of health citizenship. And as part of this larger project I'm working on with Philippa, I got really interested in distinctions between local foods and organic foods. We hear those 2 terms come up a lot, and I was really struck once. I read a Time magazine article that began with the writer saying that a while back he had an apple problem. He was at a grocery store and he was trying to buy apples, and he was stuck and he was staring at this display, and he wanted to know, he was in New York City, and he said, do I buy the local apple that was produced upstate in New York, but grown conventionally, or do I buy the organic apple that was trucked in from California? So all the greenhouse gas emissions to get the apple across the country, but it was grown without chemical additives. And in the end, he bought both apples because he didn't know what to do. But I think that response is more than just cheeky. I think that apple problem can tell us a lot. And one thing it can tell us about is what's become known as supermarket paralysis. That idea that we don't know what to do. How do we make decisions? And so If you look at this, the language that we use to talk about environmental responsibility, what you see at the center is that a responsible consumer is a knowledgeable consumer. We need to be knowledgeable about the things that we're doing. This is what this framework sets up. But what I want to ask, the cranky questions I want to come along and ask are, where does that knowledge come from? And what does that knowledge do for us? And what does that knowledge do to us? And so there's a bunch of different things. And I'm going to just leave loose threads because I'd rather be provocative than offer answers. But why are people migrating more toward organic and local foods in the first place? Researchers have looked at what do people think about when they think about local and organic foods, and it turns out that most people feel pretty good about each of them. They don't really know what those things mean. I live downtown Toronto, so Maple Leaf, what is it? I don't eat meat, but Maple Leaf processors counts as a local food for me. So do Battery Bird eggs. So what are the parameters of the local? Just because you're buying something from within your local neighborhood, it doesn't capture the full picture. With organic produce, then we have concerns about crop loss, soil erosion, other things that become factors. But so these are two words, local and organic, that are kind of fuzzy and we feel really nice about them. But when we push at them a little bit harder, things get interesting. So they're terms that carry a lot of weight, but we have to open them up and think a little bit more what they mean. And I think one of the things that they mean is that on a collective level, individual citizens are not happy with current systems or food production systems, right, generally. So what are we really talking about when we talk about local and organic foods? That's something we can open up. And within that language, we see, again, an emphasis on choice and responsibility, but these are really huge, huge terms, choice and responsibility, and they're often set up in a framework that is actually consumer-driven and consumer-oriented. And as soon as you frame things like choice within a consumer framework, you've already crossed out a whole bunch of different options that we could look toward larger regulatory and legislative frameworks to think about food production rather than downloading responsibility onto individual consumers. So that's one of the things that we can look at tonight is how do we look at some of these bigger issues that are blocked. The language of choice and responsibility blocks certain perspectives from view and makes it harder to talk about some of these issues. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about how within this language of choice and responsibility, how do we be good environmental citizens? How do we make good informed choices? We have this language of risk that is instilled in this language. So we think about, well, we want to minimize our health risks, we want to minimize our exposure to environmental carcinogens and other negative chemicals. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But when we look at things like food miles get a lot murkier than they sound like. They're a great marketing technique to talk about how far your food has traveled, but that doesn't account for the energy taken to produce the food, the fertilizers that are used when food is being grown. It doesn't talk about refrigerations, transportation, storage, all of that, so that this bigger framework we need to look at a little more closely. And in this language of risk, when we're talking about individual responsibility and choice, we only really have space to talk about certain risks. So we talk about risks to personal health, or local environmental risks, or economic risks, but it blocks out other kinds of risks like food security, questions about population health. So this framework of choice and responsibility in terms of environmental health is one that's a lot more troubling than it seems at first glance. And so what I'd like to do is try to open that up a bit. And I think Meredith will be addressing some of the issues that I've raised so far. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So I'm a humanities scholar as well, and very much like people in English, philosophers are also interested in concepts and words and what do our words mean and why are we meaning these things by these words. But I think the thing that might make philosophy a little bit different than English is that, as I like to say, philosophers are full of should. So rather than just looking at words as they are, we like to think about words as they should be, or could we have a better concept? And I'm a moral philosopher, and the moral concepts that I'm really interested in are the concepts of responsibility, respect, and trust. And I'm interested in how different concepts of responsibility lead to different actions as either individualizing, which Colleen was talking about, or as collectivizing, or creating solidarity. So what does that mean? That's very abstract. I'm interested a lot in the issue of food security and different ways of trying to address food security. And one method of thinking about being responsible for your food choices is to say, as Colleen was talking about, that the individual is responsible for informing themselves about what's healthy and what's unhealthy, and then they're responsible for making informed, wise choices that's going to influence the market. And in response to consumer choices, the market will offer us better goods with better values. That's kind of the way economics is supposed to work. By making our individual choices, the market's supposed to create the good for everyone by responding to the values that our dollars express. So that's one sort of model of individual responsibility. But the problem with that model is that not everyone has the same amount of dollars. So not everyone's voice is going to be as loud in trying to shape market values as other people who have more dollars' voice will be, which is, I think, something that Monique might have brought up a bit in her topic when she was talking about the voices of the mining companies come to dominate these ecological studies because they have a lot of influence in funding the studies. So what I'm interested in is sort of more shared models of responsibility. So how can we think about responsibility that we are doing together? One of the problems with shared responsibility is that, unlike individual responsibility, where you can point to a single agent and say, you're responsible because you did that, shared models of responsibility are more diffuse. So why do we have these responsibilities? And the reason that I think that we have these shared responsibilities is because we're always presuming that others are present in our society. So there is no such thing as an individual action or an individual choice, because any choice that I make has to assume that there's a whole chain of others who are involved in bringing that to me. So what I want to know is, can we think about how through shared responsibility we might be able to influence the choices available? So on the individual choice model that Colleen was talking about, you're faced with certain apples, and those apples are just there. And then you're responsible for choosing well among the apples. But the kinds of questions that I'm interested in is, so how did it get to be those apples? Who made that choice? There's a prior question of choice that is already assumed in selecting among apples. So food security is a problem that's faced by many, many, many Canadians. And the main way that we've tried to deal with food insecurity is by providing an emergency food response. So things like food banks that you can go and visit. And the existence of food banks does do a good job at meeting a sort of stopgap emergency situation. But when you go into a food bank, you're often rendered rather passive, right? So here's sort of a personal story. Before I started my undergraduate degree, I was reliant on food banks for a while. And the model of responsibility that they had was that they were responsible for giving us food, and our role was sort of to show up and beg for it. And they were quite suspicious of you, especially towards the end of the month when they were running out of food. And so a lot of the interview process was me as a recipient of aid trying to prove to them that I was incapable of helping myself and so therefore needed the assistance. And this is a very sort of passive model that makes the person seeking assistance into, well, they play a passive role. They don't have any kind of agency. So what I'm interested in when I'm talking about shared responsibilities are more kind of empowering responses that can get the voices of the people who are being offered assistance onto the table, shaping the choices, even when they don't have a lot of money. So shared responsibilities are responsibilities that we personally have. They're not like collective responsibilities, where a collective responsibility might be the responsibility of a corporation, say, where no individual is particularly responsible, but the corporation is. Shared responsibilities are ones that we all have, but that can only be discharged through collective action. So community health centers are actually pretty good examples of these. But in terms of food security, there's now what are called community food centers, and this model is starting to grow throughout Ontario. It started with the Stop in Toronto, but it's now with the Table in Perth and the Local in Suffolk, Ontario. And the community food center model is actually trying to build a community space as well as meeting food needs. So one of the problems with the food bank is you get your food and you go away and you're often left with an assortment of things that don't seem to really add up into any kind of meal. And there are also things that have been donated precisely because they don't go bad, which means that they're the kinds of foods that are full of chemicals and preservatives and are often actually detrimental to your health. So while you're trying to meet your basic nutritional needs, you can actually be damaging your health over the long term. So the community food center takes a different approach, and it tries to break down the barriers between those who are offering assistance and those who are receiving assistance by offering the people who are receiving assistance a chance to sit on the board and make decisions about what kind of food is served, a chance to sit on the board and make decisions about what's going to be offered in the community space. So they'll often have things like a community kitchen that serves a free lunch program that's staffed by the people who receive food aid themselves at times, right? And so this is sort of what I mean by a shared responsibility model, where the idea is to build solidarity and capacity among food recipients, because I think Monique is right that as individuals our voices aren't very strong. But when we come together and take a shared responsibility for trying to change the conditions of our choice, we're much more successful. So I'm interested in what responsibility should be, not just what it is or what we understand it to be.
Thank you very much to Meredith and to all of our panelists. We definitely have a lot to think about. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. There's food coming out at the back, so grab some snacks and exchange some thoughts, grab another drink, and we'll be back to have some discussion afterwards. Okay, we'll get started again. Thanks, everybody. You can return to your seats. We're going to get into the discussion portion of the evening tonight. So, because we've got a bit of a full house this evening, rather than asking audience questions to go through the mic tonight, I think what I'm going to do instead is we'll do this more dinner party style. So if you have a question or a comment to add, we're going to rely on you to speak very loudly so that the mics can pick you up. And I'll just ask you to kind of stand up and make yourself known, and I'll ask you for your question as they come up. To get started, I kind of wanted to throw one question both to the panel and to the audience as well. The question that really occurred to me through the initial remarks that we had was about this question of individual responsibility versus kind of broader forms of responsibility. So especially when we talk about mitigating the effects of climate change, or how we can possibly move things away from the path that we're going down when it comes to environmental degradation and climate change. A lot of the conversation that we hear nowadays is all about personal responsibility. So, for example, encouraging people to walk instead of driving, or, to take transit instead, or, bring your own bags. All of these very, very small actions that are supposed to add up to broader things. So that's, really focused on individual responsibility. And I think a lot of people feel very frustrated by that. I mean, I certainly do. I feel as though, it's not something that everybody is definitely going to jump on board with. So a lot of people feel as though it would be better if we had regulatory frameworks or legislation that required more green actions. But then on the flip side, there's a lot of questions there about limiting people's choice and people's freedom to kind of do the things that they wanted to do. So I was just wondering whether maybe the panel could comment on that, and then maybe we'll throw to the audience for some comments as well. If you'd like to jump in.
Sure. So one of the things that I like about the idea of shared responsibility is that it's neither bottom up in the sense that individual responsibility is bottom up, nor is it top down in the sense that government responsibility or regulatory responses are top down. And I think both of those have problems, as I was saying before. when you're talking about bottom-up responsibility that is individualized, some people have resources to make their voices more well heard or their choices more well represented, which creates an inequality. But likewise, when you have government and regulatory responses, these are also supposed to sort of account for the welfare of the most citizens possible, which means that the welfare of marginalized groups can end up getting overlooked, right? Partly because policymakers often come from fairly privileged backgrounds themselves. They take a particular approach to research and come to particular kinds of understandings that aren't always the same as the lived understandings of people on the ground. So I think that sort of community responses that are neither individual nor top-down, but are sort of collective and shared in that sense, are a way of kind of helping people to stay motivated, because you're not doing it alone, you're doing it with others, and you get support from doing it with others. But also, it lends support to your voice so that you can sort of affect broader change in a different way and make your experiences known to, say, government groups, so that the kinds of legislations that they might bring about actually reflects your lived reality.
Just a quick question. How would we initiate community responsibility if we don't use individuals or regulatory bodies to kind of get it going?
So I don't think you have to not use individuals, because the community is made up of individuals, right? And I also think that for community groups to get going, you need to have some kind, and this is why I'm saying it's neither one nor the other, you need to have some kind of funding mechanism, right? But there used to be a lot of community building funding grants available, for example, in the 1970s, where community groups got to experiment with trying to build different ways of serving the community that were sort of locally conceived. And so, for example, in Toronto, a lot of parent-child centers were developed, and these were places that are sort of indoor playgrounds, basically. So it's not a daycare, but it's a place where parents can come together and talk about what they need as parents in a safe space where their children can play. They don't necessarily need to have their eyes on them to know that they're safe. And there's fewer grants that are experimental like that these days. I think that there's a lot more desire to already know what the outcome of the thing that you're applying for, that you're going to fund, is before you start to fund it. And I think that to an extent, worse governance can sometimes result in more creative solutions, because those solutions are coming from the people themselves. So that's what I mean. You need to have both government involvement and individual involvement, but without one taking priority over the other, so that something sort of synergistic can come out of it.
Great, we'll hear from Colleen. I think also reflecting a bit more on the terms of the language that we use to talk about a lot of these issues is really important. And so I often think, in thinking through these issues, I think about what the difference is between talking about citizens and talking about consumers. And I think that's a really big difference. And so if I don't want to bring a certain mayor that is in a municipality sort of 4 hours from Sudbury into this, but what that certain mayor often says is he refers to people that live in Toronto as taxpayers. As soon as you call someone a taxpayer, you're closing off other ways of understanding the people that live in a geographic or economic or community area. And as soon as you take taxpayer and turn that into citizen, we become sort of more full-bodied participants in our culture. And so that difference between citizenship and consumer behavior, I think, is really important here, because the responsibility has been downloaded to consumers, so that we have to be as informed as we possibly can be when we go to the grocery store to think about how far something's traveled, how it was produced, etc. I'm kind of a big fan, I never thought I would say this, but I'm kind of a big fan of regulation, actually. I think that some of this does have to come top down, because it is in a lot of corporate interest to keep choices open, because it allows the market to say, we'll let the market decide how we want to solve these problems, but some of these problems are tougher than that, and we can't shop our way to a better environment or better health. And so I think that that's one thing that we want to be really careful is, as we're talking about these things, what terms do we use even to enact the debate? Because that closes off some possibilities and solutions before we can even think about them.
Can I?
Yeah.
This ties very well with what Monique was saying earlier about scientists and the access to scientists, because what's happened, and we were involved in a community group in Sudbury, we had to get experts and scientists, even lawyers. And because there have been so many taxpayer sort of pressure to outsource smaller government, the lawyers in town and the scientists, environmental scientists, are all looking to the government for contracts. They will not support a community group. It is unbelievable. Even, I'm an engineer. I couldn't even get an engineering firm from Toronto to review a traffic plan in Sudbury because they were so worried. It's a huge issue. We had money to pay. We couldn't pay people from Sudbury to do work for us. Engineers, lawyers, geologists, hydrogeologists would not work for us, with a very few exceptions.
Can I respond to that? So, thanks for your comment. One of the things that we came up with, or came up against rather, with the soil study was at one point we wanted to try and do a little bit of a human health risk assessment of our own, and we wanted to do blood, hair sampling and urine sampling and blood sampling. And we had actually gotten funding to do it. We got a lot of support from the labor movement with the work that we were doing, because labor was very concerned about the human health risk assessment. And we encountered the same thing. A lot of the labs in the city did not want to work with us. As soon as they found out what we were doing, they didn't want to support us. We ended up having to send our results to New Brunswick in order to be able to get them analyzed. So we encountered that kind of challenge as well.
Just another thing, question I'd like to have. Yeah, it's actually on the topic of language, and like I'm all for the idea of people being viewed as consumers, but in the idea of people who are viewed as citizens, especially for people who aren't necessarily, in the legal sense of the term, as citizens of Canada, being viewed as such, even though some of the people are more citizens than even people who are born in this country. Being viewed as such, even though legally they're not actually viewed as such. I know a friend of mine, he just recently got his citizenship, but some of the questions that are on that citizenship test, I don't know.
Well, when I'm talking about citizenship, I'm not talking about particular national citizenship. I'm talking about members of civic culture. So I guess I'm using that as a flexible term, just to think to sort of three-dimensionalize ourselves, so that we're not just people with wallets that are running and shopping and climbing and jumping our way to the cure or to solving various problems, but that we're looking at sort of deeper, more complex systemic solutions. And so I guess I'm using citizenship there in a very broad sense, because I think you're right. I think there's a comment back here. Is that related?
Absolutely. Language is huge in how we roll out programs as well. One of the most hated pieces of legislation in most jurisdictions, has no impact here in Northern Ontario nor Northern BC, is air care or emissions testing of vehicles. And in both cases, BC and Ontario, the rollout of the program was disastrous because of the language that was used. Even though citizens themselves said, yes, we believe in these kind of things, suddenly it became an imposition. And my question really to you is, how do we encourage then as citizens, governments, not just to adopt something, but to make it palatable?
That's a big question. Are you from BC? No. I just recognize air care. I'm a Vancouverite. So that's an interesting question, because I think questions about persuasion are often overlooked, about how the terms we use to describe things can pull people on board or not. So a really common, or sort of one of the central principles of rhetorical study, or the study of persuasion, is that we need to have common ground, or some kind of meeting of minds, as one important theorist says. We need to have some way of identifying with each other. So you have to use terms that other people identify with. And I think in a lot of these cases, you get kind of a finger waggy sort of, you get mommed and dadded into doing things, rather than the appeals actually working within the terms that you find valuable. So I think that that's one of the issues. It's hard to comment kind of in the general about it, but In terms of specifics, for example, I study health and medicine in particular, and doctors have really tried to figure out how do we get patients on board with the courses of treatment we prescribe, because a lot of patients don't take the pharmaceuticals they're prescribed, or they don't even fill the prescriptions. And so there's been different models that have been offered, shared decision making, etc., and they're all kind of uneven. But I think it really depends on the context. But one of the key principles is you have to make sure the person understands why they need to do what they're doing. And so, yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but I think it's really important because how we decide what products to buy or the decisions that we make are informed through persuasive processes that I don't think we pay enough attention to. Yes?
Just along the same line, I'm a great believer in regulation, but to get that you need to have 60% of the people on board. I've got a bit of a problem. I've got to do grand rounds next month at the hospital, and I'm doing climate change from the new IPCC report and what the implications of it are. And my question is, how much of it should be, you look at the David Suzuki Foundation, there's a lot of, we'll call it fear-mongering side of things, as opposed to the other side, we're trying to spin it into a positive thing. How much of my time should I spend on each side of that to get the most audience buy-in?
Depends on the audience.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the audience.
It's going to be basically the doctors of the hospital.
And they would be your audience?
Yeah, at 7 a.m.
Bribe them. Yeah, that's a big question, though, for thinking about. This is moving away from environmental health a little bit, but it is a big question if you're thinking about, for example, vaccination and vaccination rates, and how do you persuade members of the public who have lost faith in science and are choosing not to vaccinate, largely for reasons because they don't necessarily believe the science behind vaccination. What do? Browbeating doesn't work. Ridiculing doesn't work. Fear-mongering doesn't work. Those kind of sad, appeals to the poor children that is supposed to make their hearts break, that doesn't work. So how do you? And I think one of the problems, I can speak to the vaccination issue in particular, and we can extrapolate from there to some of these other issues, but with vaccination, the one route I think that hasn't really been tried is trying to figure out why people are moving away from vaccination. What kinds of questions are left unanswered for them? Because I think it's a deep mistrust of science. I think it's concern about pharmaceutical involvement in medical research and about abusive research subjects and about advertising and all of these other things that make people very suspicious, that I think we can look to climate change science and climate change denial as another area where it's not that people are stupid or lazy or whatever else. I think that there's a really big issue there that they don't agree with the underlying premises of what we're talking about. So I think that those are things that we can look to is try to address those core beliefs, because you can't persuade someone until you have you don't have to have your beliefs mapped perfectly onto each other, but you have to have some way of seeing the other person's perspective before you can even get anywhere at all.
Actually, this was something that came up a lot at our Science Cafe that happened last month on March 18th. It was all about why misinformation sticks. And the biggest piece about it was that, in order to change people's minds or to persuade them, that you need to somehow be able to mesh what you're saying with their own pre-existing worldview. So just a little plug for that. If you're interested in catching up on that one, the podcast is on our website, sciencenorth.ca.
This is a bit of two things. At the Citizens Climate Lobby, we talked about how do you communicate. We were asking about how do you talk to your group. We were taught how to make presentations depending if we're talking to a liberal, a conservative, a neo-democrat, or someone else. So there's a different language and different words we use, and we're trying to persuade them to put a fee on carbon. The second thing is that we watched the Years of Living Dangerously on Sunday night. And in there, they're in the Bible Belt, and they're talking to people who don't believe at all, that climate change, you believe this, God is telling us this is going to happen, and if we pray enough, it's going to come over. And this one lady, I forget her name. Do you remember her name, Hugh?
She's from Ontario, from Etobicoke.
Exactly. She's one of the top climate change scientists in the world. And she's also a fundamental Christian. And she's found a way of communicating to the Christians about, God has given us, we've messed it up, now we have to clean up, He's going to help us, but we have to do our share too. And it's amazing how that has changed the view of some of the people there as well.
But it was her language, and you're right about the connection. As a Christian talking to another Christian, they made the connection and they accepted what she had to say.
I think to speak to that and what you were talking about before too, not to get all rhetoric-y on everyone, but
that's what you're about.
but it's what I do. I'm actually here to persuade all of you to be rhetoricians. But Aristotle used to talk about how in order to persuade anybody about anything, you need to have you have to have an understanding of 3 basic principles, and then I would add a 4th as well, which is the speaker or the author, the audience or the reader, and the text itself, what you're trying to communicate. You have to assess all 3 aspects, and like a triangle, all 3 have to be equally weighted or you're not going to get anywhere. So you have to understand your audience. You can't just give the same talk to the same people over and over. So if you're speaking to doctors on ground rounds, that's really different than if you're trying to persuade patients or administrators, right? So you have to fine-tune what you're addressing. And then the 4th thing, kind of encircling the triangle, would be context. You have to think about the time and the place and the circumstance in which you're communicating. And then that can help, I think, to communicate in those contexts.
A comment from over here. The comment as to how scientific information is presented to people is all about scientific communication. And scientific communication is very, very limited. People are getting a lot of messages from scientists that they don't believe. And why don't they believe them? Because I think that there's a lot of advocacy going on in the science realm that really doesn't belong there. Scientists should not be advocates on one side or the other. They should be speaking for the science that they're doing. And if they're not speaking for the science that they're doing, nobody's ever going to believe them.
That's an interesting point. Does anyone want to weigh in?
Can I weigh in on that? So I think that was one of the major problems that a lot of people had with the Sudbury soil study, actually. If the mining companies were mandated to fund the Sudbury soil study, and I think that was valid. However, I think it was a problem that they were a part of the technical committee that oversaw the study. If they had pulled away and allowed the technicians, the scientists to do the work independently without them even being, just the fact that they were present at all of those meetings just overshadowed the whole process and gave people a mistrust of it. And that was very problematic. And there are a lot of people who were involved in the Sudbury soil study who say that the mining companies in no way tried to impact the results or tried to change or modify the results of the study. But that doesn't matter. They were there, and that was the problem.
It's the appearance of the bias that is worse than the actual bias or potential bias itself.
Yeah, can I just make one comment on that as well? And this sort of makes me think a little bit about the Citizens United decision in the United States, where they said money is speech, right? And so you can't limit money's contribution if people are going to use it to express their opinion. And that was a very controversial court decision. And I think that the court's not wrong, right? Money is speech. You can use it to get your opinion across, but I think that the prior question is, should it be? Or, is that good for a democracy? Or should maybe we limit the way that people can use science as a sort of PR tool, right? And I think that the answer is probably yes.
I'm in nursing, and we're really big on advocating that the client is the expert of their own health and that they need to make informed decisions, right? And I wonder how much of this we've created in our own society, because we're saying you're the expert, so you do the research and you shouldn't just take what the doctor says for gold and then just accept what he has to say. You actually have to have that conversation. So I think with Google and things like that, I don't know how many times I Google my symptoms and then I go to my doctor and say, I have this, and now that I'm in nursing, he's like, yeah, you probably do, So the thing is that we've kind of built that society, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I love when I can talk to a client and they know what they're talking about, or if they just have somewhat of an understanding, it's a lot easier than when they know nothing, because you don't want them to be blind either. So.
Can I comment on?
Go ahead.
Okay, a couple of things I'm struck by. One is the use of the term client in healthcare context is really interesting if you think about that versus patient and what happens in models of decision making. I never, when I was like a 20-year-old disaffected punk. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm also a huge fan of authority, actually, and expertise. And I wonder a little bit about, in models of shared decision making, what happens to authority? Because the question of autonomy can slip really easily to a kind of abandonment, where you have people who, when you end up in the healthcare system, you're not usually there because you're happy and healthy. And suddenly you're in a place where you have to make decisions that you may not feel equipped to make, and so you're left going, well, what do? I don't know. And so if my doctor turns to me, as mine did the other day, a specialist, and said, well, what would you like to do? Would you like an MRI? And I said, I don't know. I don't have an MD. So there's interesting questions there that that I think you can see the kind of the bleed of a consumerist model into other realms. And I do wonder about that notion of expertise, and if it isn't worth preserving a little bit. Which is weird to say.
So I want to respond to that as well. So I teach nursing students, so yeah, at Ryerson that's the main gig.
I'm a third year here at Laurentian.
Oh, great. And that's actually one of the things that I noticed, particularly it's true of nursing students. I was a little bit involved when I used to be at Dalhousie in teaching med students, and there was also a very strong emphasis on patient autonomy, but not nearly as much as there is in nursing. Right? In nursing, it's sort of like the prime directive, right? But I think that it's also important to remember the history of where that came from, because it used to be very much that doctors didn't have just expertise; they also had authority. And I think there's a difference between having authority and having expertise, because with an authority, it's still very much a top-down model, and I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to obey. And I think that kind of model was important to get rid of. And it's interesting to me that the original reason for the introduction of sort of patient-centered care was about bringing values into it specifically, right? So the idea was, yes, doctors might have medical expertise, but decisions about health aren't just about medicine, they're also about the patient's value. So what kind of value does the patient think life has for them? And these kinds of things. And so the consultation is supposed to be one where both things were coming to the table, but I think that perhaps because in the wider culture, this idea of consumer decision making is so dominant that we kind of sort of slipped towards a more consumer model. So I think that the idea of expertise is very different, actually, than the idea of authority.
But how many people associate authority with expertise? You know what I mean? And I think that that goes really well with this, because with doctors having authority, I feel that as soon as they lost their authority, general people, thought that they also lost their expertise. That's just, pardon me? It's kind of like that's just kind of how I've been noticing going through this program. Yeah.
The concept the gentleman raised earlier about absolute science being pure, there's a dichotomy, just like within the pharmaceutical or the Lyme disease, that anecdotal evidence is not valid. You need to have the double-blind test. This goes to the medical community. And I'm an empiricist. I work in a field that is highly, highly complex, and I can't talk to the researchers who work in the theoretical side of my community. We don't share the same. It's two different sciences. Just as it is in the, and maybe you could talk about why Lyme disease is marginalized, because it is complex. It mimics other diseases, so you can't do the double blind. They've done it, and it's very, very difficult.
Sorry. Well, we don't have to talk about this right now, but I want to maybe put on the shelf, because it's come up a couple of times now, is the question that science shouldn't be advocates, or scientists shouldn't be advocates. Because I do wonder about that idea that we expect science, as soon as we talk about how we expect science to be disinterested and objective, well, language theorists have studied lots about science and how scientists communicate, how they write their lab notes, how they communicate in teams, how they communicate their results in peer-reviewed journals, and it turns out that it's, and I'm quoting someone here, but it's seeded with social interest. There's social interest that runs all the way through the language of science, and so I think that that's a question that we need to ask, but I don't want to take up the time right now on it, but we should come back to that, I think. That's great. Okay, we had a question at the back that was related, I think.
You're not really allowing scientists to have this authority, and you're associating authority with expertise. So my question is, if we're not also allowed to be advocates, then we're basically not allowing what we're experts in to be going through culture or society. society. So it's very confusing.
Okay, so I wasn't trying to disallow scientists from being experts. I think that they should be experts. But I think that that's different than being an authority. So someone who's an authority is kind of in control and gets to make decisions on their own. They're like a boss. But an expert...
We're not supposed to advocate, which also kind of takes away any say we have as well.
I don't think I said that.
No, I think a commenter said that. I think scientists are well poised to be advocates.
I think the person who made the comment was saying that they should advocate for the science and not for commercial interests. I think that was what that's what you said, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, not for one side or the other. Not for the side that's paying the bill, for the side that the science is actually telling them. They should advocate fiercely on behalf of the science and not on behalf of, you know, this grant is coming from this group over here. Well, you know, my results are kind of right here, but I'm going to report them somewhere here on the right because, you know.
We don't do that. That's usually where data is.
Right, so what we're saying here is that it's very important that the scientists be free to report their data accurately and to advocate for what that data actually represents.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that has caused distrust in, say, pharmaceutical companies is the number of shady practices that have started to come to the fore, like ghostwriting articles and then having physician scientists sign off on them as if they had written them, or creating journals like the Australasian Journal of Bone Health that was basically just an advertorial. And these kinds of things degrade people's trust in science. So although you have to sign non-disclosure forms to do a lot of this research, I think that that's one of the structural things that we should look at that should be wrong. Like, I don't think I think we should publish the results of research, especially when it's research that has widespread effects on health, rather than sort of being, how do you develop this product in the first place?
I think the big problem too is a lot of the funding is not coming from people who aren't, they're coming from the companies that are interested in this, and of course people get weirded out by that, but the funding's not coming from other places. The public's not funding that through the government, so there's no other choice, and yet we're skeptical of it. So, what are we supposed to do?
So tax the companies and distribute it through arm's length research bodies like CEEEC, CIHR, and SURE. I think that that's the better solution, because when you have financial interests involved in the creation of knowledge, you're going to corrupt people's trust in that knowledge. And you're also corrupting the dissemination of that knowledge.
We're going to go to Colleen for a second. Well, and one thing that we also have to consider is what happens with, for example, people who are recipients of federal research funds and are not allowed to communicate the results because they don't correspond to the interests of, we have the muzzling of scientists happening, so that is something real to contend with as well. But the other thing to remember is we can talk about the science, but all of science from the beginning to the end is human oriented, it's human devised, and so researchers identify research questions, they identify appropriate methodologies. The methodologies don't identify themselves. They don't interpret themselves. Humans do that, and they present results in particular ways. And so we need to keep that in mind as we're talking about objectivity and those kinds of questions. And then related to that is we also have a lot of research being done by young professionals who are also working their way up through research infrastructures as well. So it's not just a matter of communicating the science bare naked, but as a way of advancing their own careers. And I don't mean that in like a Machiavellian sense. I mean truly that they have to publish in the right journals, they have to publish results that will help them accrue future research funds. If we think about those issues rather than kind of bury them down and think just about the science objective and pure, we can start to maybe find more robust answers to a lot of these questions.
I just wanted to add that I think it's a huge problem that the only funding that you can now get to do research in science is through private companies, and that there needs to be some sort of regulatory mechanism that taxes those companies, puts that money into independent bodies, and that those bodies fund the research rather than the companies themselves. And just to give you an example, when we were involved in the Sudbury soil study, we had a few scientists who became part of the committee and then had to withdraw because they received funding from the mining companies and felt that funding was going to be jeopardized by their participation in our committee. But I also wanted to talk about the fact that it's a problem for community organizations as well. We see less and less funding coming to community organizations from the government. We see more and more of it coming from private companies. And so we have things like the Valley Hospice. We have all kinds of initiatives in the community that are funded by mining companies and that the community organizations have to attach that company name to in order to be able to get that money, and that's a problem as well.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions from the audience on a different topic? Okay.
My topic is on actually nutrition, and the public has been, I've been advocating nutrition all my life. I was a professional chef, and I have heard so many people say, well, last year it was eggs, and now we're, you know what I mean? Like, it's so hard for the public, the general public that isn't really into taking care of their health as much as they should, to say to me now, oh, well, last year that was good, and this year it's not. And then, you know, you're watching Dr. Oz, and your whole house will be full of stuff. And they're going, well, Dr. Oz. No, I know, it's all merchandising. It's all merchandising. The companies are paying for it. But it's very hard for the general public that doesn't have an education in food to understand that the Canada Health Food Guide is actually a great tool. But then they're saying, no carbs, no this. Like, it's a very, very controversial thing to eat right for people that don't understand, you know, the basics of eating right. So I find the scientists have really, since I was younger, I fought for the dairy board for making sure that margarine couldn't be turned white to look like butter. And, you know, I fought for many things with the dairy board because I had a dairy farm. But I just find that the scientists have really, for the benefit of food right now that we're talking about, they have really screwed up a lot of people's thoughts on, you know, the controversy that they brought out has really screwed up a lot of people's thoughts on healthy eating with their children and everything. Like,
can I rescue the scientists?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, scientists, they do all kinds of research on nutrition, and a lot of it's really valuable. And I think one of the things where, and I don't want to be all anti-consumer, because that's not my deal at all, but I'm interested in how public discourse shapes health beliefs and behaviors, and one of the things I notice is this emphasis on optimization and avoidance of risk that happens. And I think it happens a lot in magazines and newspapers, and frankly, it sells. And I think that that's one of the big issues to deal with is if there's always some new thing to avoid or some new thing you need to eat, then you're going to buy that newspaper. And so one day when I was working on a project where I was talking about discourses of risk and optimization, and I was procrastinating. And I was reading the Globe and Mail, and just on the front page of the Globe and Mail were like 5 different stories about how to make the perfect pancake, how to get your barbecue ready for the summer season, how to make the most nutritious lunch for your kid. And this idea that we can constantly and incrementally improve and optimize what we're doing, I think it breeds a lot of anxiety, and it's something to watch out for. Yeah, so don't watch Dr. Oz.
Yeah, no, I don't watch it.
So I'm a scientist. I'm sorry. So I think though, like, one point to make is that, you know, this distrust of scientists, this issue of scientists don't know what they're talking about because one year they say one thing is healthy. The issue is language in part, and it's because scientists don't deal in absolutes. We test hypotheses, we conduct an experiment, and we deal with probabilities. And that doesn't get the public, the general public doesn't understand that. And that's our fault as scientists because we're not able to communicate that. It's also the education system's fault because they don't understand that we're not, science is not about absolutes. It's about testing hypotheses and determining what is the most likely answer. You get into this thing when you talk about creationism too, like the theory of evolution, right? This idea that evolution is some theory that someone can, just like I have a theory about who killed JFK, I also have a theory about how life evolved on Earth, or how it evolves. It's not the same thing. We have a problem with language, and I think that's part of the issue. And as a rhetorician, perhaps you can speak to that, but I think that that's part of the problem. And I think that that's why there's this distrust, or at least partly this distrust of climate change deniers and all the other business.
I agree with you, and I think one of my least favorite English sentences is the sentence, I know it with 100% scientific certainty, or I don't know it with 100%. Yeah, because it's impossible. And one of the things I teach in my classes is critical thinking, and I teach the difference between deductive and inductive thinking. And I always try to get across to the class that inductive thinking is not the kind of thinking that gives you certainty, but it is the kind of thinking that all science is using. And they're all stunned by that, right? But I think, yeah, I mean, I think we should strike the sentence 100% scientific certainty from all articles written in the future. But then, Colleen, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a couple things to say. Yes, I've thought a lot about the language of science, and one of the things I look at a lot in my research is how scientific results are reported in popular media. What happens to those results as they're reported, and I think a few things happen at once. One is that language is totally contextual. We use language in certain contexts. Language is a really flexible instrument, and we use it, and we perceive it very subtly. And so scientists use language in very particular ways, and the language that scientists use, frankly, is not unlike the language used by other researchers in other disciplines. We use a lot of modals. So those are words that suggest uncertainty. So there may be, there possibly, there might be, it seems that. And that's a convention in a scientific paper. You would never say, X caused Y. You would say, it seems that X likely caused Y, right? That we're always qualifying because we don't know for sure. We might find out more. Language is always provisional. That stuff does not fly in the public sphere, and that's one of the problems. We're uncomfortable with uncertainty. It doesn't make headlines. And so one of the questions is, who is more persuasive? This is a really classic rhetorical example, actually. Who is more persuasive? A doctor or an actor playing the role of a doctor? And who could better persuade his patient? And I think that that's true if we're talking about science communication. How do we convey results in ways that are meaningful? Well, scientists often emphasize process. They emphasize methodology. They emphasize, what was the other thing I was going to say? I don't remember, but anyway, they use modals a lot, and the sights and sounds of scientific language are very different, and so scientists are actually very unpersuasive in the public sphere. We have some scientists that really rise up, and it's because they learn how to operate in this new, or this different discourse arena. So I think the advice I would give if you want to be a scientist doing that is learn how to address your new audience. Don't speak to the public as though they're scientists, because oh yes, I remember the other thing. They use a lot of noun phrases. That's the other thing that scientists use a lot of. So like non-ferromagnesium silicate minerals is one example. To talk about rocks, right? And so we have nouns piling up on nouns because the language of science is very specialized, but the public doesn't care in that level of detail. So clawing back the level of detail could actually help a lot if you want to communicate yourself.
But if you couple that with corporate interests, then, like already there's a distrust because you're saying, well, maybe, but not 100% certainty. And if you couple that with corporate interest funding the research, then you really put the public in doubt. Like, they really don't know, what to grasp as what's real and what isn't. So.
I just want to put in one other plug for Science North Science Cafes here. We actually did an entire event on this in December 2012 called Truth in Science that was all about the ways that we communicate science and the ways that we communicate that kind of uncertainty. So again, there's a podcast of that available. sciencenorth.ca/cafe. It was actually an interesting point because we saw that a big part of the issue is that there tends to be sometimes a disconnect between scientists and the media. So we were really encouraging those two groups to work together a little bit more, and also to work with other kinds of science communicators, right, like science centers, museums, etc. And also, just that we've seen this huge decrease in funding for science in the media lately, right? So it used to be that newspapers had entire science sections with science journalists. That pretty much doesn't exist anymore in Canada. So that's part of the problem there as well, is how it's communicated. Yeah.
One of the other things I just wanted to go back to is the idea of like health and food, and also the idea of legislation in the sense that legislation dictates what we're allowed to put into our bodies. I worked at a local health food store probably 3 years ago now, and we used to sell a free-range egg, but the supplier of that egg, they shut him down because he wasn't grading his eggs. His eggs weren't graded. They weren't going through a process to make sure that they were the definition of healthy. should we allow governments to regulate what we want to put into our bodies if we so choose? I mean, I know that you can't necessarily give that to other people because of legal ramifications, but if a person really wants to do that, should you be allowed to stop them? Kind of like the idea that they had with, there was a dairy farmer in the States who was supplying milk to, raw milk to customers.
I literally have like completely torn on it. I spend a lot of my time in New Zealand where they have very different pasteurization legislation, and I know people who were motivated to move to New Zealand because they can get unpasteurized milk. I'm completely torn.
Just to throw in a comment.
Yeah. I can weigh in a little bit about this, and the reason why I can is because there is that balance we need to strike between like collective health and safety, we might say, or collective welfare, and individual choice, right? That idea that we should be able to put what we want in our bodies. And food is sort of a new area for me, but I've looked for a long time at alternative health and its interactions or interfaces with the mainstream pharmaceutical medical world. And I've become really interested in why do people take natural health supplements? Why would someone choose to take one form of external remedy that is processed by the body like a pharmaceutical versus taking a pharmaceutical? What are the reasons behind those choices? And so I've looked a lot at regulation, and I get the argument that we should be able to put what we want in our bodies in one sense, but in the other sense there are very real health consequences, and I think that some of the reasons why, and food again is different than this, but some of the reasons why people take natural health supplements is actually because they're really good pharmaceutical citizens. They're so good at it that they want to kind of keep taking external substances to support their health, because there's the idea that we need to support our bodies through external intervention rather than sort of sleeping more and exercising more and those kinds of things. And recently, natural health supplements are regulated differently, and there have been newer studies or new results about different products that have been contaminated. And so that's one of the big issues is on the one hand, people should be able to take what they want, sure, but on the other hand, how do they know that what they think they're taking, they're really taking? And so there was kind of a joke going around, people I follow on Twitter, about how some homeopathic substances were found to have acetaminophen in them, and the joke was, oh, so it contains actual medicine.
On that issue, the recent expose on Tamiflu underlined, I don't know if you've heard, but the benefit of taking Tamiflu reduced, here's a word that's overused, fractional. Now, is that an improper fraction, which means it's, fractional is a useless word. I hear it every week in the media. But the pharmaceuticals through clinical trials, very good statistics, can say that it reduces the effects of the flu in 100% of the cases. But it might be only by 3 hours. And to me, that is scientifically dishonest.
Was there a comment?
Yeah, but you don't know what's...
When it comes to food advertising, how come the public doesn't tend to criticize advertising as much as it does like scientific publications? So, for instance, if you were looking at a bread product and it was labeled as organic, a lot of the time that product, to ensure that organic certification, you're actually going to increase carbon emissions to create that type of product. Or you can get the heart and stroke label on a bread product basically by buying it out through your company. So how come basically people fall for these things, but they're always questioning scientific publications and what scientists tend to give out, and they don't question blatant lies that are in front of them during the presentation.
So you spoke to that in your presentation.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes us feel good to buy things that say organic and natural on them, right? That's part of it. But I think it's also a kind of collective opting out in some ways. I'm from the West Coast, so everything's very organic there. And
I think that part of it is an opting out of sort of a mainstream kind of agri-food complex, and the idea there is when we buy things that have those labels on them, it feels like we're doing our part and we're keeping our bodies pure and clean. But you're right. I mean, the question about whether or not it's to choose like a local food, an organic food, or a conventional food is really messy. It depends on the growing season. It depends on the method of production. It depends on all kinds of things. Where even if we're thinking about food miles really captures only a very small amount of the total greenhouse gas production of any food item, right? But it sells, and I think that that's one of the biggest things is that the decisions we make as consumers in response to advertising is it's very dependent on sensation and how we feel as we make these choices. And again, I don't want to be down on consumerism, but we now live in a culture where we define ourselves by what we buy. And so we negotiate our identities by buying this kind of cereal, that kind of cereal. I remember today in the airport chatting up a guy at security because he had Tom's of Maine toothpaste. And I sort of felt like I could identify him as a certain kind of person based on that purchase. So I think that one of the questions there that we would ask is that with advertising, we tend to take a lot of those things at face value, and there are not clear definitions for a lot of terms like natural. What does that mean? No one really knows. Organic is sort of moving toward regulation, but again, ethnographic research on what consumers think about natural, organic, local, they don't know what those things mean. They just know that they all sort of feel vaguely positive.
and can I just comment on it? Like, I think that what you're asking is a psychological question. So why do people trust this and not this? And I'm not a psychologist, so I can't answer that. But I think that what you're bringing up, that I was trying to touch on a little bit, is related to one of the problems with consumer culture. So Colleen in her presentation talked a lot about how the idea of being an informed consumer who's going to make wise choices that are going to benefit the environment is very prevalent. But one of the things that I think is a problem with that is that it's not just difficult to be an informed consumer, it's impossible because companies often obscure the supply chains, so you can't actually find out about it. I remember it was 2010, 11, 12, I was trying to buy a new computer, and the Foxconn scandal about the installation of the suicide nets around the company had just come out. And so I was trying to buy a new computer, and I wanted to buy one that wasn't sourcing from Foxconn. And it was impossible to find out whether the computers that I was thinking of buying were sourcing from there. So I think one of the big problems with the consumer choice model is that, you know, advertising and marketing will put on the product whatever is going to appeal to consumers and make them feel good, but it's not aimed at informing you, right? And you know, way back when Adam Smith was writing about economics and sort of taking the utilitarian ethical model and applying it to the market, one of the things that he said was that individuals acting on their own values is going to create the greater good because the greater good is then going to reflect our values. But you can't act on your values because you can't know what you're buying. It's just not possible. So I don't know the psychological answer, but I do think that it's a problem. And yeah.
No.
Okay, I think one reason we're apprehensive of science more than we are these logos is scientific articles are very difficult to read. They're very technical. So as a consumer, I pick it up. I don't really understand what it's trying to tell me. So I'm kind of apprehensive of, you know, the conclusions it makes. I don't know how it got there. If there's a heart and stroke logo on something, then I can understand it. That means it's good for my heart. So I can trust it.
But why is it scientists' fault that you can't understand it?
Well, I'm not saying
why is it my obligation to make sure that you can understand what I write? Why don't you, as a consumer or as a citizen, educate yourself so that you can understand what is written in these articles?
Well, I'm not saying it's a scientist's fault, and I think one important consideration is that there's a scarcity of time, and I can't become a specialist in every field so I can understand every article made. So I assume that there's some institution that kind of filters it down and makes it so it's accessible to me. And I think ultimately that's why we're more skeptical of science than we are of things that we perhaps should be skeptical of.
One thing to consider though is that I think members of the public aren't reading scientific articles that much. I mean unless they're open access. I don't know that. I mean, my dad is really smart. He's not an academic, and I don't think he's ever looked up an academic journal in his life. I don't know if he would know how to or how to read it. And I think that what the public looks to is public communication of science to get their information. But the thing is that what a lot of the science today tells us is a big bummer, right? It limits our choices in what we want to do. It limits, like we don't have to ride my bike there. It means we have to like really think big questions about redesigning whole neighborhoods and communities rather than like little tiny choices. And I feel like I want to backpedal a little bit when I was talking about consumers before about, I buy recycled toilet paper, I buy organic foods, like I do those things myself, and I think that consumers, when they make those decisions, it's coming from a good place. It's not just because people are just passive and gullible. I think that that's actually the opposite. I think people make these choices because they are trying to affect action. But I think once we trouble the discourse or irritate it a little bit, what we start to see is the problem is a lot bigger, and we need to start pushing for bigger forms of action. What those forms of action are, I don't know. I would turn to someone like Meredith to figure it out, but I'm really good at pointing out problems. I think on that note, we could probably talk about this all night, but I think it's probably about time to wrap it up. We will be hanging around for a couple of minutes as well, so if you have additional comments, please do come up and speak with us. From my perspective, I really wanted to first of all thank everybody on our panel for their fantastic remarks and response to these questions. I'm going to let Jillian give the full list of thanks for some of our supporters and partners, but I also really wanted to thank Jillian and her team for helping to co-organize this event. It's been absolutely fantastic. So I'll pass it over to her.
So just quickly, thank you Dana, thank you panel, Meredith, Colleen, and Tony. It was great. Thank you to the audience. I learned a lot from the entire discussion. And in terms of technical support, Sean Soderman on the camera, Tanius Mercer, who is in the back somewhere being fabulous, and Brendan Shan, who I met tonight, helped with photography and sound and everything. Thank you very much. And Jamie Robertson, who helped organize the whole thing. So thanks very much, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming out. The audience was amazing. Our next Science Cafe event is actually going to be in October. We're taking a break for the summer, so the fall series will start up in October, November, and December. If you're interested in getting more information about the events that we're going to be covering, please leave us your emails on the evaluation forms on the tables, and we'll be sure to let you know when they come up. It's also really helpful if you can fill them out with what you liked and what you didn't like, so that we can make sure that we have great events for you in the fall. Thanks so much for coming.